Morning Year 12. I want to talk to you this morning about graphical user interface. When it comes for you writing your NEA, if your NEA is going to benefit from having a graphical user interface, you're going to lose marks if it doesn't have one. So not to say that you have to have one, but we certainly want you to have a go with Tkinter to start off with. There are other ones as well that you can use, but Tkinter we're all going to have a go with and hopefully learn a few things along the way. We need to import from the Tkinter library. Before we do that, we're just going to have a quick recap of importing from other libraries that you're already familiar with. So if we go from random, import everything, and then we can get started with it and then say n is equal to randint is one of the things that I want to use from random. Print off n. Just run through that. Seems to work. That's absolutely fine for small projects, not a problem. When your project gets a bit bigger or you're working with other people, particularly actually if you're using your own libraries, which is very easy to do in Python, you've got a problem that you could actually have a clash of identifiers. You might be having, whatever it's an object or a subroutine, you might have a clash of identifiers and it's not going to work. So a better way of doing it, we'd rather you didn't use that phrase, we'd rather you use import random, would be a lot better. So that's sort of considered to be more robust programming and more maintainable. It now doesn't work because it doesn't know what randint is, and the way your identifiers now work is that all the subroutines and objects that you're going to use from the random library now have to start with random.randint becomes the entire identifier, random.randint becomes the identifier, and that's going to avoid any clashes with names of other objects and subroutines from other libraries when you can come to import lots of things. The other thing you can do is you can take control over what this word is at the beginning of each of your objects and subroutines that you're using from that library, and you can use an alias. So I'll say I want to call it RA instead. Now it's not going to work because instead of having random you should just have RA. So RA is an alias for random that works, and that's, that's quite a nice way of doing things. That's the way I'd like to do things when I'm using Tkinter. So we'll have import Tkinter, but we'll use an alias as tk. Don't have to, you could just use Tkinter instead, but I just want to use tk. The first thing we're going to create is a window, so we're going to use the tk object, and it works like this. You just say w equals tk, that's the alias part, that's from here, and then the actual name of the object within the Tkinter library is tk, and that creates a window. So just have a go with that for a little bit and have a go at making some windows. It's not a bad idea actually if we call that w1 and make another one as well. Let's go for w2 equals tk dot tk and just make a few windows and experiment with that. See that they're working properly, so you've got a couple of windows on your user interface. Now then, we can put all kinds of things on these windows, and the first thing we'll look at is a button. So the name we use for the different individual elements that can work on a graphical user interface are widgets. So the first widget we'll look at is a button. Let's call it b1 equals tk. Remember, we've got to do that before any of the subroutines and objects that we're using from the Tkinter library, and then we're going to put in button, and that hopefully will create a button. I do need to, the first parameter that button takes, first argument that I'm going to put in button is going to be w1. It's just saying which window do you want that button to appear on. Now then, the button's created, but you won't see it. So when we run it, it doesn't know where to put it. Being able to place widgets on your windows can be quite a complex thing to do, and there are different ways of handling the way in which those buttons appear. We call those methods geometries. There's 3 geometries. Now, when you're coming to do your NEA, please do not faff around with spending hours and hours deciding where your buttons are going to go and using a complex geometry. Just to begin with, we want you just to put the buttons on. Just get the buttons on there and get the whole thing working. If you want to make it look nice later, then do that. You're not going to get loads of marks for it though. So the way we do it is we just say button 1 needs to be placed somewhere on that W1. You're going to use this geometry called pack, and that's really good. All right, that's very, very clever. Python does all the work. You don't have to worry about it. You just say what geometry you're using. I'm using the pack geometry. It's not going to display if you don't put that in. What will happen is your widgets and your windows will be made as small as possible, and there are algorithms written into pack which will decide where your widgets go. So that's it's a good way of doing things initially, definitely. You can see your window's got really small and your button is working, so that's what we want you to do. The other thing that we want you to put in is this line, W1 dot main loop. I'm just going to get rid of that W2 for a minute just to clear a bit of space. Now then, when you did your Scratch programming, you used the Scratch language really is an event-driven language, and you can use things like forever loops and those bits and pieces. This thing is just like saying while true, do all of this. It's constantly running. Don't be put off that it appears that you don't need it. You do need it. It's just that when you're working in a runtime environment, you probably don't need it. However, that's not necessarily how your project's going to work. You might want to then have it written, actually compiled, rather than just running in a runtime environment. So put that in, and it's just the same. It's a forever loop, which is just constantly checking whether the button is being pressed or not. That's all that's happening. So if you run it, it will still do what you had before. So just remember to put that in, please. Okay, now then, before we go any further, I want to talk about arguments and how they work. So we're just going to have a look at something else just for a minute. Let's have a look at this particular thing, something you're fairly familiar with, and this sort of thing, AB equals div mod, and then let's put in, 7 and 27, and then we'll print off A and print off B. Let's just run through this and see what this does. Let's change those numbers around. Let's put 27 and 7. Let's see what happens this time. We get a different result. So the position of these arguments is important. This thing here is saying I want 2 values. So we've got a subroutine, if you like, and it's returning 2 values. And obviously when you're returning multiple values back from a subroutine, your identifiers that you assign them to just use commas, so it's picking up both of those return values. It also has 2 arguments. Their position is important, and this is just saying how many 7s are in 27. There's 3 of them. What's the remainder? 6. So it's doing div and mod together. But the position of those arguments is important. Those kind of arguments are called positional arguments, and you've seen them before as well in the print statement. Print's quite interesting. Quite an interesting thing, really. Let's have a look at a few things to do with print. So if we have hello, comma, world, we could think of this as having positional arguments as well, and the position of those arguments is important, and we can run through it. Now, there are optional arguments as well, so let's just put those in. Before we do it, I just want to put in another line. Put in print by. Okay, let's just have a look what we've got. One of the ones that you sort of first use is this thing, end equals by default, end is going to be a new line. You can see you had that new line when you ran it before, but you can change that. So this is optional. Now, there are other ones as well. So let's just put in another one, sep equals, and run through that and see what that does. And you can see the separator there is just putting that in between the two things for these strings that you've got. These arguments are a little bit different to positional arguments, and in actual fact the position of them is irrelevant. You can go absolutely anywhere. Let's just put them, let's just rearrange it a little bit, and you can experiment with this yourself just to get really comfortable that these arguments are not positional arguments. Their position isn't important, it still does the same thing. However, because of that, and because of the fact that you can choose as many of these as you want, we have to have a word in front of them to say what the argument is, because their position is not telling us what that argument is. And they're called keyed arguments, they're called quargs. If you want to write program subroutines that use quargs, it's dead easy, you can do that yourself. But at this stage, just look at this print statement. We've got some positional arguments to begin with, and then we've got these other arguments, quargs, that are coming later, but we must have a key with these. They're keyed arguments to describe what they're doing. So let us get back into Tkinter, because button also works in the same way. So the first argument is actually a positional argument, it's just what window it's going to appear in, and then we've got some other ones. And this one, text equals press me, we'll put in, just have a go with that one and see what that particular keyed argument does on button. Let's run it, and you can see that you've got the text on the actual button that's changing. Alright, now then, so far so good, except our program isn't doing anything, so we're just going to write a subroutine. Let's call it, I don't know, hi. Okay, let's have a look at that. Now I'm going to just forget about Tkinter a minute and just in here just run that subroutine. So we'll just go hi like that and run it just to check that it's working properly. And you can see we're getting output of the screen. Now we don't really want you to have a combination of graphical user interface and the runtime environment, but that's something that we're going to do just to begin with to start to get used to Tkinter. So the other thing we can do, the other keyed argument we've got here is command, which is really useful. Just notice with command that it will just run a subroutine, that you don't have to put the open and close brackets in it, but it's going to do it there instead. So let's get rid of that and then run it. And you can press me and it's saying hello in the runtime environment. Now later on you're going to get it to maybe say hello actually within the window or another window. But to begin with, that's really all we want you to sort of work with at this stage, is about this level. So that's kind of all the bits and pieces. I would spend a bit of time doing some experiments, just writing some other subroutines, trying some other buttons. You've got to pack them, remember. You've got to describe where it's going to go and just play with those ideas for a little bit. Okay, thank you.